at 7:30 in the morning on a freezing December day in 1944. A young sergeant named Marcus Webb was doing something that could get him court-martialed. He wasn't drilling his squad. He wasn't studying maps of the Rhine crossing. He was sitting cross-legged in a bombed-out barn in eastern France, taking apart a machine gun that had been officially declared obsolete 6 months earlier. To anyone watching, it looked like Webb was wasting time with museum pieces. But Webb wasn't interested in antiques. He was a gunsmith from Montana, a guy who had spent his teenage years fixing hunting rifles for ranchers, and he was looking at a problem that most officers refused to acknowledge. The problem was simple. The Army's standard-issue weapons weren't designed for the kind of war they were fighting now. Webb knew where the war was headed. The rumors were already spreading through the company. They weren't island-hopping anymore. They weren't taking French villages. The next target was Germany itself. They were going to hit the Siegfried Line, a defensive wall of concrete bunkers and dragon's teeth tank traps that stretched from Switzerland to the North Sea. The Germans had spent 5 years building it. They called it impenetrable. The standard American machine gun, the Browning M919A4, was a beautiful weapon. It was reliable, accurate, and beloved by the troops. It fired 400 to 600 rounds per minute with a steady, controllable rhythm. You could put rounds exactly where you wanted them. But Webb had a gnawing suspicion that accuracy wasn't going to matter when you were facing reinforced concrete walls 3 feet thick. He needed penetration. He needed something that hit harder. He stopped fidgeting when he found what he was looking for in a supply depot that was supposed to be shipping surplus back to England. It was sitting in the corner, covered in cosmoline grease and marked for disposal. It was a Browning M2 heavy-barrel machine gun, the big brother of the standard infantry gun. But this wasn't the famous 50 caliber Ma Deuce that everyone knew. This was the forgotten middle child of the Browning family. It was chambered in .30-06, the same round the infantry used, but it was built on a heavier frame. The barrel was twice as thick as the standard gun. The receiver was reinforced with extra steel. It had been designed in the 1920s as an anti-aircraft weapon, meant to be mounted on ships or fortifications. But by 1944, it was considered a dinosaur. The military had moved on to faster, lighter designs. The gun weighed 47 pounds without the tripod. Add the tripod, and you were hauling 7 pounds of steel. The standard M1919 weighed 31 pounds. Nobody wanted to carry the extra weight. The officers had studied the ballistics reports and declared that the heavy barrel didn't provide enough advantage to justify the burden. They'd written memos. They'd made charts. They'd decided that the old M2 heavy barrel was useless for modern warfare. Webb pulled the gun out of the depot. It was covered in dust and bird droppings. The barrel had surface rust. It didn't have a proper stock. It was designed to be fired from a fixed mount, not carried by infantry. It was a piece of industrial equipment, not a soldier's weapon. When Webb dragged it back to the barn, his squad looked at him like he'd lost his mind. They asked him what he planned to do with a boat anchor. When he told them he was going to carry it into combat, they laughed. The platoon sergeant, a veteran named Kowalski, who had fought through North Africa and Sicily, listed all the reasons why this was the dumbest idea he'd heard all war. First, the weight was prohibitive. A machine gun team already carried the gun, the tripod, spare barrels, and ammunition. Adding another 20 pounds would slow them to a crawl. Second, the rate of fire was nearly identical to the standard gun. What was the point? Third, they didn't have the right tripod for it. The mounting brackets were different. They would have to jury-rig something that might not hold up under fire. They called it a boat anchor. They called it Webb's folly. They told him to put it back in the depot and stick to his standard-issue M1919 like a good soldier. But Webb was a gunsmith. He didn't look at the gun and see what the manual said. He looked at it and saw physics. That heavy barrel wasn't just weight, it was a heat sink. It was mass that would absorb the shock of firing and stabilize the weapon. And that thick steel tube meant the bullet would spend more time accelerating inside the barrel. More velocity meant more kinetic energy. More energy meant better penetration. Webb ignored the mockery. He cleared a space in the barn and went to work. He needed a tripod, so he took the standard M1919 tripod and modified it. He drilled new mounting holes. He reinforced the legs with scrap steel from a destroyed German truck. He welded on extra bracing until the tripod looked like it belonged in a factory, not a battlefield. He needed better sights, so he scavenged a rear aperture sight from a damaged bar and mounted it on the receiver. Now he could dial in elevation for longer ranges. He needed a way to carry the beast, so he fabricated a custom carry handle from angle iron and bolted it to the top of the gun. The result was ugly. It looked like someone had built a machine gun in a high school shop class. He tested it at a makeshift range they'd set up in a quarry outside the town. The other guys in the platoon came to watch, expecting entertainment. They expected the heavy gun to be just as boring as the standard model, only heavier. Webb loaded a belt of standard ball ammunition, the same stuff they used in their M1 Garands. He didn't do anything fancy. He set up a series of targets at 100 yards, sandbags, wooden planks, and a piece of sheet metal from a wrecked half-track. He settled behind the gun, braced the stock into his shoulder, and pressed the trigger. The sound was different. It wasn't louder, but it had a deeper quality, a bass note that you felt in your chest. The gun fired with the same cyclic rate as the standard model, but each shot felt heavier, more deliberate. The barrel barely moved. The extra weight soaked up the recoil like a sponge. Webb put a sustained burst into the sandbags. They didn't just get holes. The heavy bullets punched clean through the first bag, through the second bag, and embedded themselves in the third. The standard M1919 would have stopped at 2 bags, maybe. He moved to the sheet metal. He fired a short burst. The bullets didn't just puncture the steel. They tore chunks out of it, leaving ragged holes the size of quarters. The kinetic energy of the heavy-barreled gun was noticeably higher. The laughter stopped. Kowalski walked up to the target and ran his fingers over the holes. He looked back at Webb. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me how to load it." Webb trained the rest of his squad on the heavy gun. They practiced breaking it down and setting it up. They practiced changing barrels. They ran through every drill until they could service the weapon blindfolded. They became true believers. They knew they were carrying an unsanctioned weapon. They knew that if it malfunctioned, there was no supply chain for replacement parts. They were on their own. But they also knew that when they hit the Siegfried Line, they were going to need every advantage they could scrounge. January 30th, 1945. The 94th Infantry Division was preparing to assault the West Wall near the small German town of Nennig. The Siegfried Line here wasn't just concrete. It was a fortress system of interlocking bunkers, minefields, and pre-sighted artillery positions. The Germans had built it to stop an army. The Americans were about to throw themselves at it anyway. Webb's company was assigned to take Hill 303, a ridge that overlooked the Moselle River Valley. Intelligence said there were 3 bunkers on the hill, each one a reinforced concrete pillbox with walls 4 feet thick and firing ports the size of mailbox slots. Inside each bunker was a German MG-42 machine gun. The weapon the Americans called Hitler's buzzsaw because of its terrifying 1,200 round per minute rate of fire. The plan was simple, which in military terms meant suicidal. The infantry would advance across open ground while mortar teams suppressed the bunkers. Once they got close enough, they would use satchel charges and flamethrowers to clear the positions. The planners expected heavy casualties. They always did. Webb's squad was in the second wave. They watched the first wave go over the top at dawn. The men moved out in a skirmish line, rifles at the ready, breath misting in the frozen air. They made it about 50 yards before the German bunkers opened up. The MG-42s didn't sound like machine guns. They sounded like industrial saws, ripping through lumber. The rate of fire was so high, it blurred into a continuous buzz. The German gunners had the range dialed in perfectly. They swept their fire back and forth across the field in overlapping cones of death. The first wave went down like wheat before a scythe. Men were screaming. The medics were crawling forward through the frozen mud. The attack stalled before it even started. The mortars were firing, but the shells were just kicking up dirt around the bunkers. The concrete absorbed everything. A few lucky hits went through the firing slits, but the bunkers had multiple chambers inside. You couldn't knock them out with indirect fire. The captain was yelling into the radio, calling for artillery support, but the guns were busy with another sector. They were on their own. The survivors of the first wave were hugging the ground, pinned down in a shallow depression about 75 yards from the nearest bunker. Every time someone tried to move, the German gunners cut them down. Webb's squad was crouched behind a destroyed stone wall. The lieutenant was supposed to give the order to advance, but the lieutenant was staring at the carnage in the field with wide eyes, frozen by the reality that his men were going to die if they moved. Kowalski looked at Webb. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Webb was already checking the heavy gun. He ran his hand along the barrel. The metal was cold in the winter air. He checked the belt feed. He made sure the tripod was solid. He knew what needed to happen. The standard M1919s weren't cutting through the firing ports. The bullets were sparking off the concrete. They needed something that would punch through, something that would reach the gunners inside. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for orders. Marcus Webb stood up. He grabbed the carry handle he had welded onto the heavy gun. Two other guys from his squad grabbed the tripod and ammunition cans. They moved as a team. Webb didn't run to cover. He walked. He walked straight toward the nearest bunker, the one that was currently cutting down the survivors of the first wave. His boots crunched in the frozen mud. His breath came out in quick white puffs. All around him, the battlefield was chaos. Men were screaming. Mortars were exploding. The air smelled like cordite and blood. The German gunners inside the bunker saw the machine gun team moving. They saw 3 Americans walking toward them, carrying what looked like a standard Browning. They swiveled the MG-42 toward the new targets. They weren't worried. They had concrete walls 4 feet thick. They had killed dozens of men already that morning. 3 more wouldn't make a difference. They opened fire. The buzzsaw scream of the MG-42 filled the air. The bullets snapped past Webb's head, close enough to feel the pressure wave. The frozen ground erupted in little geysers of mud and ice. One of the rounds clipped the ammunition can, carried by the man behind Webb, tearing a chunk out of the metal box, but not detonating the rounds inside. Webb kept walking. He found a slight rise in the ground about 40 yards from the bunker, a small fold in the terrain that would give them minimal cover. He dropped to his knees. The tripod crew slammed the mount into the frozen earth and locked it down. Webb dropped the heavy gun onto the pintle mount and locked the traverse. The whole setup took 12 seconds. The Germans were still firing. Their bullets were hammering the ground around the machine gun position, kicking up frozen dirt. But they were aiming for where Webb had been, not where he was now. They were used to American infantry going to ground and staying there. Webb pressed his shoulder into the stock. He looked through the rear sight he had mounted. He could see the bunker clearly. It was a low, ugly dome of poured concrete, stained with mud and smoke. The firing port was a narrow horizontal slit, maybe 6 inches tall and 2 feet wide. Inside that slit, he could see the muzzle flash of the German gun. He didn't fire a burst. He didn't spray and pray. Webb was a gunsmith. He understood that every weapon has an optimal use case. The heavy barrel gun wasn't built for volume of fire. It was built for sustained accuracy and penetration. He aimed at the bottom edge of the firing slit and pressed the trigger. The gun spoke. It didn't scream like the German weapon. It hammered. Each round was a deliberate, heavy punch. The extra barrel length and weight gave the bullets more velocity. The .30-06 rounds left the muzzle at 2,000 feet per second, about 100 feet per second faster than they would from a standard barrel. That doesn't sound like much, but velocity is squared in the kinetic energy equation. That extra speed translated to a 15% increase in hitting power. The first round sparked off the concrete around the firing slit. Webb adjusted. He walked his fire up, watching the impacts. Then he put a sustained burst directly into the opening. Inside the bunker, hell arrived. The German gunner was crouched behind the MG-42, his face pressed against the stock, his hands on the firing grips. He was focused on the Americans pinned down in the field, sweeping his fire back and forth methodically. He didn't see the tracers coming through the slit until they were on top of him. The heavy .30-06 rounds came through the firing port at supersonic speed. They didn't just enter the bunker. They ricocheted off the interior walls, fragmenting and tumbling. The concrete box became a blender of lead and copper jacket fragments. The gunner took 3 rounds center mass. His loader took 2 in the head. The gun went silent. But Webb didn't know that. He couldn't see inside. So he kept firing. He put 40 rounds through that slit in steady, controlled bursts. He wasn't trying to suppress. He was trying to kill. The barrel of the heavy gun was starting to smoke, the cold air making the heat shimmer. But the massive steel tube was doing its job. It was absorbing the thermal energy, spreading it out over a larger mass. A standard barrel would be glowing red by now. The heavy barrel was just getting warm. Webb lifted his head from the sight. The German bunker was silent. No more muzzle flashes, no more buzzsaw scream. He had killed it. But there were 2 more bunkers, and they had just realized that the Americans had brought something new to the fight. The second bunker was 100 yards to the right, dug into the slope of the hill. The German crew inside had watched their comrades get silenced. They knew the standard American machine guns couldn't penetrate their bunker, but they could see that this weapon was different. They could see the sustained fire. They could see the accuracy. They swiveled their MG-42 toward Webb's position and opened up with everything they had. The rate of fire from an MG-42 is apocalyptic. At 200 rounds per minute, it sounds like a continuous roar. The German gunner walked his fire across the fold in the ground where Webb was positioned. The tripod man took a round in the shoulder. He spun and went down. The ammunition bearer dove flat, hugging the frozen earth. Bullets were snapping over Webb's head, so close he could feel the sonic cracks. Kowalski came running up from the stone wall, sliding into the position like a baseball player stealing home. He grabbed the wounded man and dragged him back toward cover, yelling for a medic. Then he ran back and grabbed the spare ammunition cans. Webb didn't move. He swung the heavy gun to the right, traversing the mount until the second bunker came into his sights. The German gunner was still firing, still sweeping back and forth, trying to pin down the entire American line. Webb aimed for the firing slit. He let out a breath. He pressed the trigger. The heavy gun hammered out its response. The first few rounds sparked off the concrete. He adjusted down slightly. Then the rounds started going in. The German gunner saw the tracers coming. He tried to shift his aim, tried to target Webb directly, but the American fire was relentless. The heavy bullets were coming through the slit in a steady stream, ricocheting inside the bunker. The German loader took a fragment in the throat. He went down, choking. The gunner held on for 3 more seconds before a round punched through his chest plate and dropped him. The second bunker fell silent. The battlefield changed. The men of the first wave, The ones who had been pinned down for 20 minutes started to move. They got up from the frozen ground and began to advance. They weren't charging. They were moving carefully, using the terrain, but they were moving forward. The third bunker was the biggest, a command post bunker with reinforced walls and multiple firing ports. The Germans inside had machine guns covering 3 different approaches. They opened fire on the advancing Americans, trying to pin them down again. Webb traversed the heavy gun to the left. This bunker was 20 yards away, at the edge of his effective range. The firing port was smaller, maybe 4 inches tall. It was a difficult shot. But Webb had spent his youth shooting elk at 300 yards in the Montana mountains. He understood ballistics. He understood drop and wind. He elevated the rear sight. He aimed at the top of the bunker and let the arc of the bullet bring it down into the firing slit. He pressed the trigger and held it down for 5 seconds. The heavy gun chewed through 40 rounds. Not all of them went through the firing port, but enough did. The Germans inside the command bunker went quiet. 3 bunkers, 3 fortified positions that were supposed to hold up an entire regiment, silenced by a single machine gun that the army had declared obsolete. Webb lifted his head from the sight. His shoulder was bruised from the recoil. His hands were numb from the cold and the vibration of the weapon. The heavy barrel was finally starting to glow a dull red at the chamber end. But it had held. The gun hadn't jammed. The tripod hadn't collapsed. The improvised mounting system had worked. Behind him, the American infantry was advancing up the hill. They were moving through the fields of fire that had been death traps 5 minutes earlier. They were throwing satchel charges into the bunkers, clearing them room by room. They were taking Hill 303. Kowalski slid back into position next to Webb. He looked at the smoking gun. He looked at the silent bunkers. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he clapped Webb on the shoulder and said, "You magnificent son of a bitch." The battle for Hill 303 didn't end that morning. It took 3 more days of fighting to clear all the bunkers and trenches. But the breakthrough at the first 3 bunkers broke the German defensive line. The rest of the company poured through the gap. They took the hill. They took the town. They pushed the Germans back across the Moselle. Webb's heavy gun took a beating during those 3 days. The sustained firing warped the barrel slightly. The jerry-rigged tripod mount cracked in 2 places and had to be re-welded in a field workshop. The carry handle broke off completely. But the gun kept working. Webb kept feeding it, kept cleaning it, kept nursing it through the abuse. On the 3rd day, they finally received orders to pull back for rest and resupply. Webb sat in a liberated German dugout, disassembling the heavy gun for cleaning. The other guys from the squad sat around him, exhausted, staring at nothing. One of the new replacements, a kid who had arrived after the battle, asked Webb why he had used such an old gun. The kid had heard the story. He didn't understand why anyone would choose a heavier, older weapon when they could use the standard issue gear. Webb didn't look up from cleaning the bolt. He said, "The manual says a lot of things. The manual says this gun is obsolete. The manual says the standard gun is all you need. But the manual was written by guys who were thinking about the last war, not this one. When you're facing 4 feet of concrete and a machine gun that fires twice as fast as yours, you need to hit harder. You need penetration. The standard gun is a great weapon, but it's not the right tool for every job." The kid nodded like he understood, but he didn't. Not really. You can't understand until you've been pinned down, watching your friends die, knowing that the weapon you're carrying isn't enough. The story of the heavy gun spread through the division. Other units started asking questions. Officers who had dismissed the old M2 heavy barrel started requisitioning them from depot stocks. Armorers started experimenting with modifications, trying to make the gun more portable without losing the advantages of the heavy barrel. The official after-action reports from Hill 303 mentioned the machine gun fire that had suppressed the bunkers, but they didn't specify which gun had done it. The officers writing the reports assumed it was standard equipment. Nobody bothered to check. It wasn't until years later, when historians started interviewing the survivors, that the story of Webb's heavy gun came to light. Marcus Webb survived the war. He made it through the Rhine crossing and into Germany. He was there when the division liberated a concentration camp. He was there when the surrender came in May. He carried the heavy gun the whole way. When he came home to Montana, he went back to gunsmithing. He never talked much about the war. He never told the story of Hill 303 to his kids or grandkids. It wasn't until a military historian tracked him down in the 1900s that the full story came out. The historian asked him why he had chosen to carry the heavy gun when everyone said it was useless. Webb thought about it for a while. Then he said, "Because useless is just another word for misunderstood. Every tool has a purpose. Sometimes you just have to figure out what it is." We tell these stories because the history of war isn't just about grand strategies and famous generals. It's about the soldiers who looked at the equipment they were given and said, "This isn't good enough. I can do better." Webb didn't invent a new weapon. He didn't design anything revolutionary. He just looked at an old gun that everyone had forgotten and realized it was the right tool for a specific job. He ignored the experts. He ignored the manual. He trusted his own judgment and the physics of steel and gunpowder. The M2 heavy barrel machine gun never became famous. It didn't get the glory of the Ma Deuce 50 caliber or the popularity of the M1919. It remained a footnote in the catalogs, a gun that was too heavy for most uses and not powerful enough for others. But for 3 days on a frozen hill in Germany, it was exactly what was needed. The gun that Webb carried was lost after the war. Nobody knows what happened to it. It probably ended up in a scrap heap somewhere, melted down for rebar or car parts. The serial numbers are lost to history, but the story remains. So the next time someone tells you that something is useless, remember Marcus Webb. Remember the gunsmith from Montana who carried a 47-pound machine gun across Europe because he knew that sometimes the old ways are still the best ways. Remember that obsolete doesn't mean ineffective. It just means forgotten. This is the story of a gun that was declared useless and the man who proved them wrong. It's a reminder that the greatest weapon in any army isn't the newest technology or the biggest budget. It's the soldier who looks at a problem and refuses to accept that the solution doesn't exist. Sometimes you just have to build it yourself.